Well, we're continuing in what I find really a fascinating study of the prophecies of Isaiah. Today we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 13. This begins a section of Isaiah called the Judgment of the Nations. And from chapters 13 through 23, he's going to go all the nations bordering Israel and pronouncing God's ultimate judgment against them. There'll be a near term and then a longer term fulfillment of the judgments. And topping the list is Babylon. We begin with Babylon, a perennial enemy of Israel. We'll continue right through the end times. Babylon is discussed in chapters 17 and 18 of Revelation. It'll be very interesting as we go through these countries because these countries were at war opposing Israel 2,500 years ago, and they are opposing Israel today. Some of them have different names, but they all continue to exist, and they all have a bone to pick or a battle that they're planning against Israel. We look at Babylon, for example. We find Babylon is a city that exists today. Not only was it an ancient city in the name of an ancient empire, but it's a city that exists today. It's in Iraq. It's about 55 miles south of Baghdad. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The city is being rebuilt. I know that it's been proposed as an international economic center by more than one person. I know the UN promotes it, but it continues to exist, and it will play a significant role in Israel's future that is still beyond us. So the future from us is not only Isaiah. Again, we'll go through these nations in chapters 13 through 23, but they continue to be significant for Israel. So when we come to chapter 13, we see the judgment that's brought against Babylon. And as Isaiah often does, there's a near-term and a far-term vision that he has. Near-term fulfillment, a long-term fulfillment. And he sees them both together. The analogy is often used of the prophet as if he was looking at mountain peaks. Here in Estes Park, where I live, we have mountain peaks all around us, and I can see the peaks, but I can't see the valleys between the peaks. And Isaiah is the same way. He sees the near-term peak, the far-term peak. He doesn't see what's all in between. And we see that here in his judgment of Babylon. So this chapter 13, I've divided it into several sections. 13:1 through 5 is God's calling of his army to bring judgment against Babylon. 13 verses 6 through 9 is a new section. It's God's obliteration of Babylon. In verses 10 through 16, we see the Isaiah looking at a further mountain peak, another judgment against Babylon that has cosmic and global proportions in verses 10 through 16. Verses 17 and 18, he discusses the near-term fulfillment of the judgment of Babylon by the Medes. And then in verses 19 through 22, the longer-term eternal destruction of Babylon. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Verses 1 through 5, where God calls his army. This is introduced as an oracle in verse 1. Literally, the word means a heavy burden. And it's as if the prophet has this heavy burden that he's bearing until he unloads it by giving this prophecy to the people of God. Verse 3, we see God gathering the nations. They are consecrated, mighty, and proud. This means that God has set them apart, that God is using these nations, the Medes in this case, and I think in concert with the Assyrians, as we'll see later in the chapter, to bring judgment on this city that epitomizes opposition to God. We've seen this before in chapter 10 of Isaiah, verse 7, God used Assyria to bring judgment on Samaria. Assyria didn't even know that God was using them, but God used them nevertheless to bring judgment on Assyria. And then, of course, in chapters 11 and 12, he turns around and judges Assyria and assures his people that they'll be restored. In Revelation 17, we see a very similar sort of situation far in the future. In verses 16 and 17, God uses a 10-nation configuration. He stirs them up, he gathers them, he is going to bring them against his enemies. He's going to bring them against Babylon in the subsequent chapters, both economic and religious Babylon. So what God is doing with Babylon in this chapter, he is going to do it, and we'll see on a global basis at the end times that Revelation talks about. Talks about the fall to the Medes. This was in anticipation of that greater day of the Lord. He talks about the day of the Lord over and over again, and it's talking about the day of the Lord as a time of both judgment and restoration. Throughout the Bible, when we speak of the day of the Lord, we're talking about judgment of God's enemies and the restoration of God's remnant. That's happened in Joel's time when he rescues them, but ultimately it will happen during the book of Revelation. Verses 13 through 13, chapter 13, verses 6 to 9 in the book of Isaiah. Then talk about the obliteration of Babylon. The day of the Lord is mentioned in verse 6 and verse 9. And this is particularly throwing light on that aspect of the day of the Lord, which is the judgment of God's enemies. It's a time of destruction for those enemies and a restoration for Israel. And ultimately, the day of the Lord in history will be worked out during that 7-year tribulation that Daniel talks about in Daniel 9:27, or verses 24 through 27, and also in the book of Revelation, chapters 6 through 19 is the ultimate day of the Lord, that this day of the Lord, we can look at it as a down payment on. We come to chapter 13, verses 10 through 16, then we see this great scope expansion. This tips us off that we're talking about a much future and global destruction of Babylon. It says, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. So he's talking about this cosmic judgment that's going to come. Verse 11 says, I will punish the world for its evil. So we see this not only cosmic judgment, but a worldwide judgment that's going to happen. Drop down to verse 12, it says, I'll make people more scarce than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. So there's going to be such destruction on the earth that people will be rare. And this brings us back to, again, the book of Revelation, the fourth seal judgment in Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 to 8, kills a quarter of the earth's population. Then later in the sixth seal trumpets judgment in Revelation chapter 9, verse 15, at that point, a third of mankind is killed. So we see worldwide destruction of mankind that Isaiah is seeing here far, far in advance. Verses 17 to 18, then, we see the near term yet again. Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them who have no regard for silver and do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity their children. So just like back in chapter 10, verse 7, he used Assyria, and in their fallen hatred, God used that to bring judgment on Samaria. So God is going to use the Medes and their disregard for any kind of plunder, their lust for destruction. He's going to use them to bring judgment on Babylon in just the same way. And then we see Let me just stop there for a moment. Historians, if you're reading commentaries along with this, whether a one-volume commentary or more in-depth, commentators are in disagreement over exactly when this near-term prophecy was fulfilled. One option is that it was fulfilled in 539 BC when the Median Empire overran Babylon. Part of the problem with that is was largely a peaceful takeover. It was largely a invasion of the city. It's in Daniel chapter 5. The Medes came in at night, snuck under the wall of the city, and brought the city to its knees before they knew what happened. So it wasn't the kind of wanton destruction that seems to be in view here. The other option is a destruction that came about in 689 by the hands of the Assyrians when they attacked the city. The Assyrians were assisted at that time by the Medes. So when it says that stirring up the Medes against them, stirring up the Medes against Babylon with the Assyrians in 689, that seems to be a better option, fits the details that we see here better. Verses 19 through 22 at the end of the chapter then return to this long-term eternal destruction of Babylon. Again, it says that Babylon, the glory of kingdoms and splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah, whom God overthrew. So Sodom and Gomorrah were never re-inhabited to this day. And that's what verse 20 says. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down. Well, that hasn't been fulfilled yet. It's not happened yet. It looks like it's going to happen in the future because we know in Revelation 18 that the destruction of Babylon will be complete and the smoke will go up as an eternal monument to God's judgment against evil and wickedness. So it seems that this is the eternal destruction that's being anticipated and not the near-term destruction at the hands of the Assyrians. So, as we look at this, one of the things that we can keep in mind as we see developments, particularly in the Middle East, but all around the world, that these are all in God's hands, that God uses the nations to carry out his plan. His plan is ultimately to bring glory to himself. How will we do that? He brings glory to himself by bringing salvation to men, and he brings glory to himself by keeping his covenant with Israel, which he will ultimately do. So as we look at the craziness that happens in the world, as we look at Iraq equipping itself with ballistic missiles and with nuclear weapons, when we see the nations of Europe on the brink of war, Russia about to go to war over the Ukraine, when we see Turkey asserting itself, we know that these are ancient nations that Isaiah will address and that God is using to bring about his ultimate glory in the last days. So take confidence, take courage, be looking for the coming of the Lord. There's a blessing associated with that, and I pray that you will reap the blessing of anticipating Jesus' return to the earth.